Awesome. Thank you. My computer's a little slow today. All right. Did you guys have any questions on the stuff before? This is our very last lecture. So after this week, you guys just have finals, which is going to be good. All right. And you guys remember that next week, you guys have finals and it's just going to be on renal. So make sure that you study renal. You'll have 50 questions for that. Okay. Yes, the final is just for lecture. This week, you have your lab final. Okay. So next week, half of you will have lab and you'll have the sensory lab. The other half, you have Memorial Day. So if you have lab on Monday, you have the day off next week. So yeah, no more lecture. So that's good, right? We're just gonna have finals next week for lecture. And then if you have the sensory lab, you'll have that. If you have Memorial Day, then you get to observe Memorial Day. Okay. Any questions on either lecture or lab? Are you guys good? Okay, good. And you guys saw that the reproductive chapter homework is extra credit, right? So it's going to be 5 points. So that'll be your last extra credit assignment. So yay, that's good. All right, so we're going to continue on with fluid and electrolyte balance for renal system. So remember for this one, it's hormones, hormones, hormones. Make sure you know your feedback loops. What's the stimulus? Who is the controller? And then what are the responses? Okay. One of the key things, if you looked at the lab videos, is that I'm very specific about blood versus urine. Whenever we're talking about what happens in your blood, we're talking about the stimulus, right? Something that's happening up at the top. When we're looking at what happens to urine, then that's telling you the response. Okay, so keep that in mind. Anytime you hear blood, stimulus, anytime you hear urine, response, right? Of course, you have to look at the question or the sentence to make sure it's in the right context, but that's really what the pattern is, okay? All right, so last time we were here, let me see. We went through this feedback loop. So this talks about high osmolarity and low plasma volume. So when we're talking about high osmolarity, we're talking about blood again, right? So what we're circling here is blood, what's happening up in your blood. Then you can see all the different things that happen, right? In order for you to regulate that so you can return to homeostasis. And so down here, we're seeing what the response is going to be from all of the different mechanisms in your feedback loop, okay? This feedback loop is a close-up version of what you see here. Okay, so what you see there is the same thing we're seeing here, but this is very detailed compared to what you see in the first one. So that's a pattern that you're going to see in your book. I'm bringing it up because I had a few students ask about it. So I want to remind you that your book has feedback loops that are overall big picture. And then they'll show you small snippets of these detailed feedback loops like this one that really go into the details of who is the controller, who is the sensor, what is the effector, okay? So this is the more detailed version of what we circled in the beginning. So on this one, we're looking at high osmolarity in blood. And when you have high osmolarity, that's not good because you have a hypertonic solution, right? So here our blood is becoming hypertonic compared to isoosmotic, right? So remember that you have a lot of salt that's here, but when you're isotonic, then your even amounts of salt, water can flow the way it needs to flow. So here we're adding a lot more salt to our blood than normal. So you're making it more hypertonic than normal. And that could affect how water is distributed in all the different parts of your body. Okay, that's why you need to regulate it. So you have osmoreceptors that are constantly checking the osmolarity of your blood. They're going to realize that your blood is more concentrated than normal. They're going to go ahead and release ADH, vasopressin, at the posterior pituitary. Remember that ADH is made by hypothalamic neurons in the hypothalamus. The axons are really long and they go into the posterior pituitary, and that's where they release out ADH, okay? ADH goes into your blood, blood goes everywhere. One of the key places where ADH is going to respond is going to be in the collecting duct of the kidneys, okay? So between collecting duct and kidneys, if those are your answer choices, always choose collecting duct, right? Collecting ducts of the kidney is more specific than kidney, okay? The collecting ducts are responsible for tailoring your urine. So one of the ways that they can tailor is by adding more water to urine or reabsorbing water from, I should say filtrate, adding more water to the filtrate or reabsorbing water from the filtrate, okay? So here, what we're gonna do is we're gonna add more aquaporins into the collecting ducts, and that's gonna allow us to increase the reabsorption of water, okay? So what that means is that you're gonna add the water that's in the filtrate back into the blood. So the urine that you're going to produce at the end of the day is going to be more concentrated than normal, okay? So less urine volume, and it's going to be more of a darker yellow orangey color. The water that goes back is going to help you decrease the osmolarity in the blood and also increase plasma volume, okay? Do you need to know that feedback loop? Yes. Do you need to know the order? Definitely, okay? So make sure you know the basics. What's the stimulus? What's the controller? What are the responses? What's the sensor? Okay. All righty. The other way you could do this is through loss of plasma volume. So you lose a lot of volume, your baroreceptor reflex is going to kick in, and your baroreceptor reflex will also trigger ADH to be released. Okay. So ADH is going to go ahead and be released. It's going to go to your collecting ducts. You add more aquaporins, you reabsorb more water, and that helps you maintain the water that you do have, and it helps you lower osmolarity. Okay. So what happens when you're dehydrating? Okay, so think about dehydration, right? Usually this is when you're doing something like exercising. Okay. When you're exercising, you're losing water. Okay, so you're losing water, but you're keeping your salt. That's the key. You do lose a little bit of salt when you exercise, but not a significant amount. Okay, you lose a lot more water. The water loss is excessive compared to the salt.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Like it's about that comment you just said, that you lose more water than salt. Like when I go to work, sometimes like I don't take off my sweater, and then by the time I take off my sweater, like my actual shirt has like white sweat on.
Yeah.
So that's like the water, or is that the salt, or
that's the salt? Yeah, that's the salt.
Is that the portion that you're
crystallizing? Yeah. So as the water evaporates, it'll crystallize on your sweater.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. That's all normal. You do lose a little bit, but not a lot compared to the amount of water, right? So that's the key here. So what's going to happen is you lose water, right? And when you lose water, things become more concentrated, right? So if we have a cup here, right? And this is you normal, then you go for a run and you sweat, right? So you lose water. You're gonna lose water, but your salt is still there. So you can see how much more concentrated it is compared to normal, okay? So this is normal and this is concentrated. That means you have a higher osmolarity compared to normal. Okay, and that's what's going to trigger that feedback loop that we just saw. When you sweat and your blood becomes concentrated, then you're going to go ahead and release out ADH, and that's going to help you retain any water. Okay, What about your thirst reflex? Are you going to feel thirsty, or are you going to feel okay if you have this kind of blood? Are you going to feel thirsty or okay? Definitely thirsty. And release ADH. Okay, cool. So just remember, if you have dehydration, right, you're going to have an increased osmolarity. That's your key, right? What about your blood volume? Do you think it's going to go up when you sweat, or is your blood volume going to go down when you sweat? Up or down? Down, yeah. Cool. So when you sweat a lot, right, like this marathon runner here, you're going to lose water from your blood, and that will cause you to have a lowered blood volume. Okay. So some other ways that you can become dehydrated are listed here, right? So we all know like when you're sweating, right? But another one is when you hemorrhage, right? You can become dehydrated. You can have severe burns, prolonged vomiting, right? Because think about when you vomit, you're gonna be sweating and you're also gonna be releasing out fluid, right? Diarrhea, fluid from the other end of you, right? We talked about sweating. If you are not allowed to drink, so water deprivation means you don't have water to drink. Diuretic abuse, that's if you're taking diuretics and you take too much, you can become dehydrated. And sometimes issues with endocrine. So different hormones can also cause you to have dehydration. Okay, so it's not just sweating. It could be due to any of these things that you could lose water and increase your osmolarity and decrease your plasma level. Okay, some symptoms are cottony oral mucosa. So I don't know if you've ever been dehydrated enough that you see like inside your mouth and it looks a little bit white, right? And it feels really dry. That's that cottony kind of feeling. Definitely going to feel thirsty, dry, flesh skin, right? All of those things just tell you need to drink water, right? So one of the things that you're going to notice with educators, mostly because I usually work with kids during the summer, is that we tell them to drink when you're thirsty. Right. Part of the reason you're going to tell them to drink when they're thirsty is because you don't want them to become dehydrated. But the other reason is because we used to tell them to always drink water. And young children will do literally what you say, right? So they will literally drink as much as you tell them. So if you're telling them to drink a lot of water, they could potentially drink liters of water within a few hours. And that's not good because you're trying to prevent dehydration, but drinking too much water, overhydration, is also a bad thing. Because if you become hypotonic, then your cells are going to react differently, right? We know that hypotonic solutions will add water to cells, and that's not a good thing. Dehydration will shrink your cells. That's not a good thing. You want to make sure that you drink when you're thirsty, because that thirst mechanism helps you maintain the tonicity that works for you normally. Okay, it helps you maintain your homeostatic tonicity. All right, cool. So this is what we're trying to prevent in young children. Okay, so one of the reasons that we changed the way that we talk about water was because a lot of children, including young adults like college athletes, they were starting to pass away due to overhydration. So because of that, we passed different laws so that PE teachers or coaches, now they can't tell you to drink a lot of water. They tell you to drink when you're thirsty. Okay, and they saw significant changes in the amount of water, like water, I guess, abuse, or what is it called? Water toxicity that they would see, right? Especially in places that are really hot, like Texas, and Florida. They had a lot of issues with it because it's really hot and humid there. So people would drink a lot of water, but if you drink it too much too fast, it could cause your brain to swell because it becomes a hypotonic solution. And then you add all this water into your cells, and that's not a good thing. Okay. So here, water is going in. Okay. In our previous example, water is coming out. Okay. Another example of this is, what was it? It's hold your wee for a wee. Hold your wee for a wee. Okay, so when the Nintendo Wii came out a long time ago, some radio stations had a competition where people would put their hand on a Nintendo Wii, and then they had to hold their pee, right? Wee means pee. This is urine. And they weren't allowed to go to the bathroom, right? But every hour they had to drink water, and a lot of water. And a bunch of people called in, nurses and doctors, and they were like, you cannot do this. They're gonna have to go to the hospital. They could potentially die from overhydration. But the people in the radio station, they were like, no, it's just water. Water doesn't hurt you. And we're like, no, water can't hurt you, right? If you become hypotonic, then your cells are going to suck all that water into them. If you change the shape of the cell, you can potentially change the concentration inside. That changes the way that the proteins fold. Your proteins denature. Your cell's not going to work the way it should, right? And that can cause a whole lot of problems. So they ended up having water intoxication. In that radio station, one person died because they drank too much water and couldn't regulate it quick enough. So yes, dehydration is high osmolarity. Water intoxication is hypotonic solution, so low osmolarity. Okay, so low osmolarity here and high osmolarity here. Okay. And again, are we talking about urine or blood when we're talking about osmolarity? Are we talking about urine or blood? What do you think? Definitely blood, right? Because urine is waste. It's what you're going to throw out. Nobody cares. You really care about regulating the osmolarity of your blood. Okay. So here you are going to have that feedback loop happening where you're preventing ADH. So we don't want to have ADH available. So you remove aquaporins and you create dilute urine. Okay, so you're peeing out all that water. But in this case, they're putting in so much water that this mechanism can't regulate your blood fast enough. Okay, so your cells swell, and the cells in your brain, when your brain swells, that's not a good thing, right? Because it controls everything in your body. Okay, so that's one of your key things that you want to remember. If you have a lot of water in your body, you have low osmolarity, you're going to stop secreting ADH. You're going to remove aquaporins from the collecting duct, right? I'm going to make a little note here. CD is for collecting duct. And you're going to end up peeing out all that water. So your urine will become dilute. With all of that feedback loop happening, hopefully you end up increasing the blood osmolarity. Okay, that's the goal. Sometimes that doesn't happen. That's when you have water intoxication. Okay. The other thing that happens when you have low osmolarity is that you also have low amounts of sodium. Okay. And that's also not good. Okay. So why is low amounts of salt important? Right? I want you to just think back from day one in this class. How many times have you seen salt in our talks? Think about every system, every mechanism that you saw sodium chloride, right? How many times and how important that is, right? The sodium potassium pump everywhere, right? Having a gradient or a low concentration of sodium is going to be a big problem. Okay, so you can see a lot of different things that it can affect. Okay, none of which are good. So it's very important not only to maintain the general osmolarity of your blood, it's also important to maintain the electrolyte balance, right? And in this case, sodium of your blood, because those ions are really, really important for a lot of things in your body. Okay, so one of the ways you can treat this is with hypertonic saline, right? So this is one of the few times that you want to use hypertonic saline, adding something that is more concentrated than your normal blood to try to balance out that concentration. Okay. All right. So we talked a little bit about this, right? Electrolyte balance, super important, right? And you remember which ones are the most important for us? It's sodium, chloride ion, potassium ion, and calcium 2+. Okay, so for us, our class, those are the 4 most beloved ions, the electrolytes that really, really matter for us. Okay, some other ones that really matter are acids and bases. Okay, so remember, acids are H+, and bases are usually bicarbonate ions, so HCO3-. Okay, we really regulate those acids and bases. We're going to see that at the very end of this talk. Okay, the place that we've seen it more recently is in the respiratory system, right? Regulating our breath in order to help us regulate the acid and base in our blood. Okay, but the renal system also helps you. The place that it helps you the most is going to be here with base regulation. It's the only place we can regulate base. Okay, let me see. I think other than that, we're pretty good. We'll just highlight these. These are just for fun to know. If you have electrolyte imbalances, then you're going to crave those specific electrolytes, right? So you're going to crave certain things that have those electrolytes, like pickles. You're going to want to literally just eat salt, right? Eat sour foods, right? Sour foods have acid. Other things that you might want to eat are things that are not common, like chalk or mud or clay, and that's called pica. Okay, so that's when you want something a little bit different, and usually that tells you, hey, you might have a mineral or an electrolyte imbalance that your doctor needs to take care of, right? So if you realize you're wanting to eat something that is not food, then you probably need to go to the doctor and see if you have an electrolyte imbalance. All right, so we looked at ADH, which is vasopressin, right? You guys remember when you use it, right? Remember that ADH is going to go and affect your collecting ducts. So it affects how many aquaporins are in your collecting duct, and that'll either help you retain water or remove water, okay? The other 2 hormones that are important here are aldosterone and angiotensin 2. And sometimes we just call it ANG, like that, and then 2. Okay, so aldosterone and angiotensin 2 are going to be really important. We're going to see them in a few feedback loops, so this is the first time we see it. Okay, so when you think about aldosterone, think about sodium. Okay, so anytime you hear the word aldosterone, you think about Na+, and that's really what it's trying to regulate. The other thing that it's going to help regulate is K+. Okay, so I'm going to put here K+. So we have 2 things that it's going to help regulate: sodium and potassium ion. Okay, when we look at the feedback loop here on the right, you notice that you have 2 stimuli. You have low amounts of sodium, so that's one stimulus that you can have. The other stimulus is high amounts of potassium. Okay, sometimes students think that you need to have both, and that's not the case, right? As long as you have one of those, it'll trigger this feedback mechanism. Okay, So if you have low amounts of sodium, then that's going to cause you to have an increased amount of angiotensin 2. That's going to go to your adrenal cortex. Remember that that's the outside part of your adrenal gland. You're going to go ahead and release out aldosterone. Okay. Aldosterone is going to go to your kidney tubules. And it's going to tell your kidney tubules to go ahead and reabsorb more sodium. And from there, you're going to go ahead and hopefully find your balance in sodium, right? You go back to your electrolyte balance, your homeostatic balance. Okay, so you increase the amount of Na plus in your blood. Okay, that's the plan. When you look at K plus, if you have too much K plus, you're going into hyperkalemia, right? Too much K plus. You're going to go ahead and stimulate the adrenal cortex to release out aldosterone. Aldosterone will go to the tubules, so it's all still the same. And it's going to ask the tubules to go ahead and secrete out potassium ion. So when you secrete out potassium ion, you're removing it from blood. Okay, so we're going to remove K plus from blood. Okay, so we're adding sodium to blood and we're removing potassium ion from blood. Okay, so that's the goal with aldosterone. When you have aldosterone, you keep sodium, you remove K plus. You keep sodium, you remove K plus. Okay, not bad. Any questions on how aldosterone works? It's not too bad. So remember ADH, right, or vasopressin is going to regulate the amount of water that you reabsorb or that you allow it to leave the kidney. Aldosterone is going to help you with sodium and potassium ion. Low sodium ion will trigger it. High potassium ion will also trigger it. Okay. The results of aldosterone are to keep sodium and remove potassium ion. Not bad? All right. Let's look at another type of hormone that's really important, and this is atrial natriuretic peptide. Okay, so ANP for short. When you think about atrial natriuretic peptide, think about the heart. Okay, and specifically the atria, because remember you have 4 chambers, 2 atria and 2 ventricles. So here we're really looking at the atria and what the atria tell us. Okay, so when your atria are stretching a lot, this is usually because you have an increased blood pressure. Okay, and that stretch is going to release out, it's going to trigger your heart to release out at atrial natriuretic peptide. Okay, so you're going to release out ANP into the blood. Okay, so increase the stretch of the heart usually means you have high blood pressure. That's going to release out ANP into the blood. And ANP has a lot of different jobs. Okay, when you look at this feedback loop, you're going to be like, oh my gosh, there's so many things. But most of this you already know. Most of this you have seen 1,000 times. If you understand blood pressure regulation, you understand this. Okay, so let's think about each part. We're going to start with the smaller ones and then go in the middle for the bigger one. So let's go to the small one here. ANP is going to talk to your adrenal cortex. And your adrenal cortex is going to be affected, and it'll either choose to release aldosterone or stop releasing aldosterone. In this case, right, we're going to lower the amount of aldosterone being released. Think about what aldosterone does. It helps you regulate sodium and potassium. Okay, sodium and potassium, those are your big ones. So if you have less aldosterone, that means you're going to release out more sodium. Okay, you're going to pee out more salt. And that's going to help lower the osmolarity of your blood. And if you lower the osmolarity of blood, that lowers your blood pressure. Okay, so keep that in mind. You're affecting the osmolarity. Osmolarity affects pressure. The saltier something is, the more pressure there is. So here the goal is to remove salt to help lower your blood pressure. That part on just the aldosterone part. Okay. Just remember lower blood pressure. Okay, and that part of feedback. So we're going to be targeting the or in is going to talk to the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is effect happens at the posterior pituitary. I'm assuming so.
Yes.
Yay. Awesome. Hopefully that's the only glitch we have today. All right, so let's go through the middle part. Did you guys have any questions on this part, or are you guys okay with aldosterone? You guys all good? Not too bad? So let's go over this middle part, okay? So here in the middle, we're looking at the collecting ducts, and then we're looking at aquaporins again, okay? So atrial natriuretic peptide will affect your hypothalamus. So your hypothalamus is going to be told, hey, our blood pressure is too high. We need you to send out either more or less vasopressin. Okay, so think about what vasopressin does. Vasopressin tells you to keep water, right? Vasopressin tells you to keep water. So if your blood pressure is high, do you want to keep water or do you want to pee it out? What would you want to do? Do you want to keep water or pee it out? Definitely want to pee it out. Very good. So you're going to tell your hypothalamus, hey, our blood pressure is too high. We need to go ahead and pee out more water. So stop releasing ADH. Just stop it. Lower that a whole lot. Okay. So because you're sending out less ADH, your collecting ducts are going to remove aquaporins from their cell membranes. Okay. So now you're going to have less aquaporin, and that means you're going to have less water reabsorption. So instead of keeping water, you're going to pee it out. Okay. Since you're removing water from your blood, you're lowering blood volume, and that helps you lower blood pressure. Okay. So some key patterns we want to remember. Aldosterone, you're going to have less of it because you want to remove sodium from blood. That's going to help you lower the osmolarity of blood, and that helps you lower blood pressure. Okay. For ADH, it's a very similar pattern. You want to lower the amount of ADH because you want to remove water from blood. That's going to help you lower your blood volume, and that helps you lower blood pressure. Okay, so make sure you know which controllers are causing this, right? Adrenal cortex is responsible for aldosterone. The hypothalamus is responsible for ADH. Okay. Any questions about either one of those feedback loops so far? Or are you guys good? Because we're going to go on the last one. This last one over here, okay, is all about angiotensin 2. Okay, so ANP is going to be sensed by your granular cells. Okay, remember your granular cells are a part of your juxtamedullary complex. It's going to tell those cells, hey, our blood pressure is too high. We need to regulate this. Okay, we need to lower our blood pressure. What can you do? So the granular cells are going to go ahead and release less renin. So you're going to lower the amount of renin that's released. Okay, so instead of releasing out a bunch, you're going to release a lot less. That renin is responsible for angiotensin 2. Because there's less renin, you're going to make less angiotensin 2. Okay, so angiotensin 2 is going to be responsible for vasoconstriction. Since you have less angiotensin 2, your blood vessels are going to open up. So they're going to vasodilate. Okay. So with a lot of angiotensin 2, you constrict. With a little bit of angiotensin 2, you dilate. Okay. So when you dilate, your total peripheral resistance is going to decrease, and that helps you decrease your blood pressure. Okay. Any questions about this side of the feedback mechanism? Or are you guys okay? All good. Cool. It might take you a moment to like come up with a question. So if you feel like you have a question, just ask it, okay? These same feedback mechanisms are also in your lab, right? So make sure that you know them for lecture and lab for both. All right, so let's take a look at one of your favorite feedback mechanisms. You've seen it 1,000 times. You're gonna see it yet again, and that's the baroreceptor reflex. So I think on the first day of class, we saw it and we saw a small version of it. And every time we've seen it, we've expanded on it more and more. Okay. In this case, what we're going to expand on it is the renal system. So we know that the baroreceptor has a section that's just about cardiovascular, and that's a fast response. That helps you regulate quick. But the long-term effect is going to be with the renal system, right? So if you want something that's sustainable in the long run, it's going to have to deal with kidneys, okay? So let's take a look at this feedback mechanism and break it into different parts. So the first thing you want to do is you want to realize that there's a key. Okay, so here at the bottom, there's a key, and there's 3 different colors. You have the green color, and this is for the Renin-Angiotensin-Aldosterone mechanism. This is your RAAS system. Okay, that's all in green. The second one is yellow. And this is going to be your neural regulation. Okay, so sympathetic and parasympathetic regulation. Okay, that's all going to be in yellow. That one's what you do quick. Okay, that's your short-term response. It's a reflex. The last one here is in purple. And this is going to be due to ADH. Okay, so antidiuretic hormone, and how antidiuretic hormone plays a part in this. Okay. So let's go ahead and do the easy stuff first, and then let's go into the stuff that's a little bit more complicated. So let's start off with the fast response. Okay, so I'm going to put a note here that says fast response. Okay, and this is the part that is your cardiovascular system. Okay, it's quick, within seconds, you should have this response. Okay, assuming that you don't have sympathetic, parasympathetic issues, right? Because some people will respond a little bit slower, okay? So this fast response is your basic baroreceptor reflex. So you have a low blood pressure. Your baroreceptors are gonna sense that. They're gonna send information through sensory neurons to your brain, right? To the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata is gonna realize that blood pressure is too low, and it's going to ask your sympathetic nervous system to kick in. Okay, so you're going to increase sympathetic activity. You're going to decrease parasympathetic activity. This results in different types of changes. One of them being that you vasoconstrict. Okay, so your blood vessels are going to constrict. That's going to cause you to have increased peripheral resistance. Okay. When you increase resistance in the blood vessels, you're going to increase blood pressure. Okay, not bad. Any questions about that fast response? Or are you guys okay? So that's our first one. Oops. Not yet. All right, so let's look at the second small one. So the purple one all the way to the right. Okay, so this is one of your slow responses. Okay, because this is going to involve the kidneys. So what's going to happen here is that you have low blood pressure. Okay, so we have that low blood pressure again. You're going to sense that in a lot of different ways, right? One of them being your heart. So your heart's going to release out less atrial natriuretic peptide. That's going to help cause your hypothalamus to release out more ADH. Okay, so here you're going to release out more ADH at the posterior pituitary. That's going to go to your collecting ducts. You're going to add more aquaporins to your collecting ducts, and that's going to help you retain water. Okay, so if you have low blood pressure, you want to keep as much water as possible so that you increase your blood volume, and that helps you increase blood pressure. Okay, so one of the things I kind of want you to notice, right? When you see these feedback loops, do they have all the details on them or just some details? What do you think? Do they have all the details on the feedback loops or just some of the details? Yep, just some of them. So one of the tips that I have for you is that as you're reading your textbook, add in all the steps that they assume that you know. Okay, add in all the steps that they assume that you know. So whenever you see a figure in your textbook, you should be writing on it, kind of like what I'm doing. You notice how I put fast response and slow response? If I was studying this, I would put in all those other things too, right? So I would put in add aquaporins, right? Increase water reabsorption. What else do I have here? I would have hypothalamus up here, but you see where I'm going, right? So if I was studying this for the first time, I would add all of those notes onto this figure so that for me, someone who's new, I would understand what all of this means and how it all ties together. Okay, not bad. I tried to do that for you in the lab lecture. So that one has all the puzzle pieces kind of put together for you. Hopefully, that's the plan. All right. So let's take a look at the big one. Okay, this one really shows you the RAAS system. So I'm just gonna put RAAS up here. Okay. Anyone that works with the heart can tell you the RAAS system is really complicated. It has a lot of different feedback loops all in one. Okay, and this shows you just a small snippet of what it looks like. Okay, so let's go over just the green parts. If you have low blood pressure, that means that you're going to have low stretch in your heart, right? So low amounts of ANP. You're also going to have less sodium chloride going by your juxtaglomerular apparatus, right? So remember that you have the macula densa that's constantly monitoring how much salt passes through there. If you have low blood pressure, less salt is going to pass through there, okay? Both of these are going to result with the granular cells being affected. So they're going to release more renin. Okay, so granular cells are going to say, oh no, we're getting a lot less ANP. We're also getting a lot less salt passing by. That means our blood pressure is really low. This is not good. Release out renin. And renin is an enzyme that will help you convert angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1, okay? And so this is a protein, right? Renin is an enzyme, angiotensinogen is a protein, right? And it's a protein that you have in your blood all the time, okay? Have in blood always. Whoops. So right now, if I tested your blood, you have angiotensinogen all the time, okay? You have a bunch of that ready to go. You want to have it ready to go because if renin is released, you want to make sure that you can quickly make angiotensin 1, okay? So angiotensinogen, ogen means that it's off. Angiotensin 1 means that you have converted it the first time. So you changed it the first time. You're going to go ahead and use another enzyme to change angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. So you're going to convert it a second time, okay? And the enzyme here is called ACE. Okay, ACE is, whoops. Angiotensin converting enzyme. Okay, and this will convert angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. Okay, so this converting enzyme, this ACE, is found in the lungs. Okay, so remember that angiotensinogen is in your blood. So when it gets converted into angiotensin 1 is also floating around in your blood. And think about all the capillary beds that are in your lungs, right? There's so many. So you have all this blood that goes into the lungs and gets angiotensin 1 converted into angiotensin 2, okay? Once you have angiotensin 2, it can go ahead and do its job. So one of the jobs is to talk to the arterioles. And because you have low blood pressure, you want to squeeze them. So you're going to vasoconstrict. So you're going to vasoconstrict. That increases resistance. More resistance, more pressure. Okay. The other thing it's going to talk to is the adrenal cortex, right? So the outer layer here. And remember that the adrenal cortex is responsible for aldosterone. Aldosterone will regulate the amount of salt that gets reabsorbed, okay? So here you want to tell the adrenal cortex to secrete out more aldosterone, okay? So now you have more aldosterone. That aldosterone will go to the kidney tubules and it's going to tell it, hey, reabsorb the salt, bring the salt back into the body, help us increase the osmolarity so that we can increase blood pressure. Okay. More salt, more water follows, higher blood volume, higher osmolarity, and higher blood pressure. Okay. Any questions about the RAAS system? If you didn't notice, you should notice that all the previous feedback loops that we just went through, they're all put together here, okay? So you're just building and building and building a bigger feedback loop and a bigger feedback loop. So make sure that you remember that your body's not how do you say it, compartmentalized, right? So you don't have little boxes where things happen. Things happen together and they work together as a team. Okay, so this chapter really shows you how feedback loops get integrated together to make one big feedback loop to help you maintain homeostasis. Okay. All right, any questions on any of this? That's good. All right, so let's take a look at a few other electrolytes that are important. One of them is calcium, and the other one is phosphate. Okay, so a lot of the calcium that you have is going to be found in bones in the form of calcium phosphate salts. Okay. Good. All right. So you have a hormone called parathyroid hormone that helps you regulate your calcium in your blood. Okay, so let's take a look at that feedback loop. So over here on the right, you have the stimulus of low blood calcium. This is hypocalcemia, okay? Low calcium in the blood, okay? Your parathyroid cells are always monitoring how much calcium you have in your blood, okay? Since they're always monitoring how much there is, when they sense that there is too low calcium, they can go ahead and release out parathyroid hormone. Okay, so they are the sensor and also the controller, okay? They release out parathyroid hormone. That hormone will go into blood and blood will take it all over the body. It's going to talk to a few different places. The first place is obvious. It's the bones, right? So if I have low amounts of calcium in the blood, I need to increase it. One of the ways that you can increase the amount of calcium in your blood is by breaking down your bone. So you're going to tell your osteoclast to go ahead and break down bone. And that calcium and phosphate is going to be released into the blood. Okay. So that's one way you can get calcium to go up in your blood. The other way that you can help calcium to go up is to reabsorb more from the urine. So sometimes we release out a little bit of calcium in our urine and that's okay. But when you have low amounts of calcium, you're like, pick up as much as you can. So you're going to increase the amount of calcium reabsorption in the kidney tubules so that less of it is wasted. So anything that you do have, you keep. The third way is by affecting your small intestine. But the way to do that is through vitamin D. So your parathyroid hormone is going to tell your kidneys to activate more vitamin D. Okay, so your vitamin D is then going to go to the small intestine, and vitamin D will tell your small intestine to add more transporters for calcium and reabsorb more calcium. Okay, so that one's a little bit more complicated. Parathyroid will tell your kidneys to make more vitamin D. Vitamin D is then going to go to the small intestine and it'll tell the small intestine to reabsorb more calcium. Okay, so in these two, we're trying to keep any calcium that we do have. And here we're trying to add calcium into our blood. Okay. Any questions about how this feedback mechanism works, or are you guys okay? Is it good? So let's look at what would happen with hypercalcemia. Oh, I didn't add it. Oh, no, I didn't. You don't have to know it. Lame. It's okay. All right. So hypocalcemia and hypercalcemia. Some key things that you want to remember when you think about calcium is that it affects electrical currents, right? The main places where it's going to affect is going to be cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Okay, so remember that these two types of muscle will get a lot of their calcium from the extracellular fluid. So if you have low amounts of calcium, it's really going to affect how your heart pumps. And then it'll also affect your smooth muscle like your GI or your blood vessels. Okay, so that's important. If you have hyperkalemia, then you have too high of a gradient, and that can also affect how your cardiac muscle and your smooth muscle work. Okay. So let's look at another electrolyte that is important, right? Another one is CO minus. Okay. One of the key things that we need to remember with CO minus is that sodium ion and CO minus go hand in hand. So wherever you see sodium ion, you're going to see CO minus. Wherever you see CO minus, you're going to see sodium. Okay, so CO minus is important because it helps you maintain osmotic pressure. Okay. The other reason it's important is because of this chloride shift, right? And we've seen the chloride shift in a few places. So we saw it in the vessels when we were trying to move bicarbonate ion in and out of the red blood cell. We also saw it in the kidneys. We also saw it in the GI. Okay, so you have chloride ion shift in a lot of different places in your body. And it's important to help us move different ions in and out of cells. In particular, pH ions, right? So HCO3 minus, it's really important for that, okay? All right. So let's start looking at acids and bases, okay? So out of all the electrolyte balance, sodium and potassium are two big ones. Calcium is the third, Cl minus is important just to kind of know, okay? The next ones that are really important are acids and bases. So acid-base regulation is super, super important. When we're talking about acids and bases, we're talking about pH, okay? And remember that your body likes a very narrow range. So we're really looking at 7.3 to 7.35 to 7.45, okay? That's our range, our normal range. When we look at different parts of the body, they might differ just a little bit. So if we look at arterial blood, it's about 7.4, venous blood, 7.35, extracellular fluid, around 7, okay? But you're really in this narrow range between 7.35 and 7.45, okay? That's your small range of what is normal. So we really, really, really regulate it, okay? When we look at how we change our pH, we're looking at different things, kind of like lactic acid, right? Fatty acids and ketone bodies that can also affect your pH. They can make it more acidic. You can change the way that you breathe, right? And that could affect how acidic your blood is or how basic it is. And another thing you can do is you can add bases artificially or acids artificially through diet, okay? And so I'm going to put here another one, diet changes, okay? Why is all of this important? It's important because our body just highly regulates acids and bases. We have buffer systems everywhere because we want to make sure that we stay within that range always. Okay, so our buffer systems are our first line of defense. You drink orange juice, you're not going to have acidosis because your buffers are working, right? You take a Tums, you're not going to become alkalosis because you took a Tums, right? You have these buffer systems that help you. The other thing that helps you is your respiratory centers. So changing the way that you breathe in order to keep CO2 or release CO2. And we saw that in previous chapters, right? That's your second line of defense. Both of those are fast acting, okay? Your slow response is renal system. So renal system will also help you regulate acids, but it really helps you regulate bases. Okay, this is the only place where we can add or remove bases is right here. Okay, so the thing with a renal response is that it's a slow response. It takes a while before it kicks in compared to breathing and compared to buffers. Okay. So I'm going to give you guys a little break because the next set of slides is going to contain some chemistry. So I want to make sure that your brain is fresh before we go into ions and equilibriums and shifting things to the left or the right. Okay, so I want to give you a 10-minute break. I'll have you guys come back at 2:55. Okay. Cool. If you have any questions, go ahead and let me know. If not, I'll see you in 10 minutes. Okay. All righty. So hopefully you guys are back. Did you guys have any questions that popped into your head? while you were resting a little bit, or are you guys okay? All righty then. So we'll start off with acids and bases, and this should take us to the end, okay? Remember, for acids and bases, we're really looking at pH, okay? And one of the things that we have in our body that helps us regulate our pH is chemical buffers. So chemical buffers are awesome because if you need to add more H plus to your system, it will add more. If you need to remove H plus from your system, it can remove it from your system. So it can add it or it could remove it. It always keeps you within a certain range, and it only works with a certain amount of load. So there is a capacity to it. If you add a lot of acid, there's going to be a point where your chemical buffer stops working, okay? If you add a lot of base, there's going to be a point where your chemical buffer stops working. So it can handle quite a bit, but it does have a limit, okay? So one of the things we need to remember is that acids will add H plus to a system. And bases will remove H plus from a system. Okay, so acids add, bases remove. Buffers can do both. Okay, so keep that in mind. We have three major buffer systems in our body. We have the bicarbonate buffer system, which we saw with blood. We have a phosphate buffer system. And the third one is a protein buffer system. So your proteins, your amino acids in your proteins can act as buffers as well. Mild buffers, but they're buffers either way. Okay. So let's go back and let's review your bicarbonate buffer system. Okay, so when you look at your bicarbonate buffer system, the equation that we want in our head, it looks like this. Okay, so you're gonna have a strong acid, a weak base, a weak acid, and a salt. Okay, don't worry too much about that. Worry about what all this means. Okay, so when we look at this, what we're really looking at is H plus HCO3 minus goes into H2CO3 plus NaCl. Okay. So this is what we want to kind of remember. Okay. So we want to remember that on one side we have our H plus and our HCO3 minus, right? This is our acid and our base. And on the other side, we don't have them. Okay, these don't do anything to us. Okay, they don't change our pH. When we look at our bicarbonate buffer system, we're able to go back and forth on this, right? So we can go in one direction or the other, okay? So what we need to remember is that if we add acid, then we're gonna go ahead and remove that acid from our solution. If we need more acid, so our blood is too basic, we can add acid to our solution, okay? So that's the key. If you need acid, it'll add it. If you need to remove acid, it'll remove it, okay? So you can add H plus or you can remove H plus, okay? So that's your key. The other thing you want to remember is that one of the things that we can make with our bicarbonate buffer solution is the HCO3 minus, okay? And HCO3 minus is really important because that is our buffer, right? That's what we're using as our buffer system. So the amount that is available is called our alkaline reserve. Okay. So as long as we have bicarbonate ion, we can regulate acid. Okay. When we've used up our alkaline reserve, then we have nothing to use as a buffer. Okay. So it's important to know that you need to have HCO3 minus in order to buffer your blood. Okay. The other thing you have to remember is that HCO3 minus is highly regulated. How much you have is important. And the only place you can regulate it is going to be in the kidneys. So that's the only place that we can remove that HCO3 minus if we need to. Okay. The other type of buffer system that we have is called a phosphate buffer system. Okay, so it's pretty close to what you saw with bicarbonate buffer system. So you're gonna have strong acid, weak base, weak acid, and a salt. Okay, so similar to what you saw before. Don't worry too much on knowing what strong acids or weak acids are. Don't worry too much. What you want to kind of remember is what all of this means, right? So you're going to end up with H plus, which is our acid. You're going to end up with HPO42 minus, which is our base. And then these two molecules, okay, that are not going to do much when it comes to your pH, okay? So again, it's going to be very similar. If you need acid, it can add acid. If you need to remove acid, it can also remove acid. Okay? So it can add acid and it can also remove acid if you need. Again, there's a limit, right? And you need to just make sure that you're within that limit and you're good. Okay? Some places that you use this phosphate buffer system are going to be the urine and the intracellular fluid. Okay, so those are two places where you might have more phosphate than a place like your blood. Okay, your blood really uses that bicarbonate buffer system, but other solutions like your urine or your ICF, they're going to use this buffer system more. Okay. All right, the last buffer system that we want to just kind of review is your protein buffer system. Okay. And you're going to see again something very, very similar. In this case, when we think about proteins, we have them pretty much everywhere, right? So you're going to see them helping you buffer all over your body, inside the cells, outside the cells, in your blood, everywhere. Okay. So you're going to use it pretty much in all the places. Okay. One key thing to remember about proteins is that they're made up of amino acids, and amino acids are going to have two parts to them. They're going to have the amine part and then the carboxylic acid part. Okay, so they're going to have the COOH and the NH2. Okay, again, it's a buffer system. So the main pattern that you're going to see here is that your protein buffer systems can add acid if needed, or they can remove acid if needed, right? So here you can see the result is that we're adding acid from the carboxylic acid. And here we're going to remove acid using the amine group, okay? So we can either add acid or remove. No matter which buffer system you're looking at, you see the same pattern, right? You add acid when you need it, you remove acid, you bind to it when you don't need it, okay? This little table gives you a quick review of all three of the buffer systems, okay? Just make sure you remember where you tend to find these buffer systems and that they add acid if needed and they remove acid if needed, okay? So let's take a look at the other more powerful ways of addressing acid and base regulation, right? So we have our buffer systems as our first line of defense, but they're limited in their capacity, right? Our respiratory system is another way we're able to regulate it. And specifically, we regulate H+, okay? We're really trying to regulate a low pH. An acidic pH. Okay, and again, we're talking about our blood, okay? So this is one way that we're able to quickly affect the pH of our blood, okay? The key things to remember with respiration is that CO2 in blood is gonna make it more acidic, okay? So if you have high amounts of CO2 in blood, that's gonna make your blood acidic. If you have low amounts of CO2, it's going to make it more basic, okay? So if my blood has a lot of acid in it, I'm going to go ahead and start hyperventilating, right? Because I'm trying to breathe out as much CO2 as possible to remove acid from my blood, okay? If I'm too basic in my blood, I can start holding my breath, right? So I'm going to start hypoventilating to keep the CO2 inside of my blood. So instead of breathing quick, right, this is hyperventilation. I'm going to now take smaller breaths, and I'm going to hold my breath more in between, right? So it's going to be short and shallow. Right, so it's the respiratory rate is a lot slower, and you're trying to breathe out less of your CO2 to keep CO2 in your blood, okay? When you're looking at the equations here, this is what we're looking at, okay? So if I'm trying to breathe out more CO2, then my equation's gonna go towards the left. We're gonna go this way, okay? So what we're gonna do is we're gonna take that extra acid that we have, and we're gonna start making more CO2 so that we can breathe it out. Okay, the goal here is to take this and help us remove it through removal of CO2. If we're holding our breath, we're gonna go in the opposite direction. So we're gonna go in this direction to try to make more HCO3 minus, right? And H plus. So adding more CO2 to our blood will help us make more H plus, and that's going to help us increase the acidity of our blood. Okay, so that's a real quick way of either adding H plus or removing H plus from our solution. Okay, all right. I think we're good. Any questions about respiratory regulation, or are you guys okay? Hyperventilation happens when your blood is acidic. Okay, so when you hyperventilate, when your blood has a low pH, you can hyperventilate to remove CO2, right? And if you remove CO2, you remove acid. Okay, that means that you're gonna increase the pH of blood. Okay, if your blood has a high pH, it's basic, that's going to cause you to hypoventilate. That's going to cause you to keep CO2, and that's going to cause you to become more acidic. So your pH of blood will start to go down. Okay, does that make sense? When you're, one of the key things is that when you're reading this, notice the word that's there, right? If you hypoventilate, it could cause respiratory acidosis, right? If you hypoventilate. So think about what results when you hypoventilate. When you hypoventilate, you lower blood pH. If you lower it enough, then your blood becomes too acidic, and that's called respiratory acidosis, okay? Oops. And the same with the next one. Hyperventilation causes respiratory alkalosis. So if somebody's hyperventilating and they can't control it, then they could breathe out so much CO2 that their blood pH increases way too much and they end up having alkalosis, okay? So that's one of the reasons they ask you to breathe in a bag, because they're trying to have you rebreathe your CO2 to prevent respiratory alkalosis, okay? Cool. That's a good question. Anyone else have any questions? It's all good. All right, so we looked at buffers, we looked at respiration. Now let's get to the mechanisms in the renal system, right? So this is our bread and butter, is right here. That means bread and butter means it's really important, okay? So when we look at chemical buffers, right, you can only sustain that for so long, okay? Your lungs also can only sustain it for so long, right? You can only hyperventilate for so long. You can only hypoventilate for so long. You always need to have some sort of long-term results, right? And that's going to happen in your renal system. So when we look at the kidneys, they're going to be able to help you regulate those acids and bases that you're not able to easily breathe out or hold in, okay? When we think about the lungs, we're really thinking about H plus and HCO3 minus, right? That we can either breathe out or hold in. When we're looking at the kidneys, we're looking at things that are non-volatile, so acids and bases that we cannot easily remove from our body. So we're thinking about all these different acids and bases that we have to remove in urine. We just have to do it through urine. And a lot of these things are created when we go through cellular respiration and metabolism, okay? Other things that we need to remember is that the kidneys are another way that we buffer, right? We have some chemicals in our urine that help us buffer, but we also have mechanisms that help us add acid to our urine or add base to our urine to help us regulate our blood, okay? So we want to really focus on those mechanisms that help us add acid, remove acid, add base, and remove base, okay? So this is what we want to focus on. So here we have a really nice figure that shows you how we're able to regulate our acids and bases, okay? So we're going to see this figure a few times, and sometimes it's a small variation of it, okay? So here what we're concerned about is bicarbonate ions. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to keep the bicarbonate ions in our body. So when you see conserving, this means to keep it in the blood. So let's put it back into blood. We know it's in our filtrate, so we need it. Let's put it back, okay? The reason it's important to conserve that bicarbonate ion is because you're conserving that alkaline reserve. Remember that the alkaline reserve is what allows you to buffer. So bringing back the bicarbonate ion allows you to keep that buffer system in your blood. If this isn't working, it's going to be hard for you to buffer blood, okay? So it's really, really important that you get it back. So let's take a look at what this looks like. Okay, so we're going to start with step number 1. So when we look at step number 1, we're looking at taking CO2 and water. We're going to combine them together to make H2CO3. Okay. We're going to use carbonic anhydrase, Ca, to help us do that. Okay. Remember that you have these items pretty much everywhere in the body. Okay. So you have water and CO2 combining with carbonic anhydrase to make H2CO3. That H2CO3 will break apart and it's going to make your acid and base. So here's our acid and here's our base. Okay. Now remember what our goal here is. Our goal is to keep our bicarbonate ion. So we want to keep this HCO3 minus. We want to keep it. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and move it back into the interstitial fluid and back into the blood. So let's take a look at how you do that. One of the ways is by using sodium in order to help power the movement of bicarbonate ion across. Okay, so you're going to use this symporter that uses the sodium gradient to move bicarbonate ion out, and then it goes into blood. The second way is by using the chloride shift. So we're going to move chloride down its gradient from high to low, and it's going to go into the cell, and that's going to help us move bicarbonate ion out of the cell. So this is a symporter powered by the chloride ion gradient. So it's going to move bicarbonate ion into the interstitial fluid and then into the blood. Okay. Remember your gradients for sodium and chloride. This is why this is working. Okay, those two ions go down their gradient, and that helps you move your bicarbonate ion. Okay. The other thing that we need to do is we need to remove that acid. So we're removing our base, putting it back into blood, but we don't want to keep that acid. So we're actually going to move that acid out of the cell and out of our blood. Okay. So we're going to take that acid, we're going to remove it through a proton pump, right? So we're using ATP to pump it out into the filtrate. And the other way is using a sodium ion to create an antiport. So sodium goes in and H plus goes out. You're going to go ahead and exchange those. Once that H plus is out, you can go ahead and combine it with a little bit of bicarbonate that's in the filtrate. It's going to make H2CO3. That can go ahead and change back into CO2 and H2O. And that CO2 can move back into the cell and you can use it for this cycle again. Okay. So some key things that you want to remember here, right? Number one, you're going to use carbonic anhydrase to help you make H2CO3. That's going to break into H plus and HCO3 minus. You want to keep the HCO3 minus. You want to remove the H plus. The HCO3 minus will come back in two different ways. One, a sodium symport, and number two, using the chloride shift, right? So you're going to move one sodium out, one chloride in. The other thing you want to remember is that H plus needs to be removed into the filtrate. You do it in two ways. One, a proton pump, and two, using a sodium H plus antiport. So sodium comes into the cell, H plus comes out. Okay. Any questions on how we maintain our bicarbonate ions? Or are you guys okay? Cool. If you got lost on what I told you, just know that there is step by step right on the right. Okay. So let's take a look at another scenario. We want to make sure that we are using the buffer system in our filtrate to help us buffer that acid. Okay. So one of the things you want to remember is that this H plus outside that goes into the filtrate, it's going to get buffered, right? Why do you think that it's important to buffer that H plus? Why is it important to buffer the H plus in your filtrate? What would happen to your urine if you didn't buffer it? What would happen to your urine if you didn't buffer it? It would make the filtrate not basic because you're adding a bunch of H plus, right? It would make it acidic. Imagine peeing out straight up acid, right? That would just burn everything. So it's really important that you have that HCO3 minus in your filtrate to buffer the H plus that you're putting out, right? Because you don't want to burn that epithelial tissue that's in your tubules, in your ureter, in your bladder, right? Imagine just peeing. No, I'm okay, right? That is not a superpower. That is definitely not, right? If you've ever eaten too much fat, like in college, I would go to Pink's hot dog stand in Hollywood a lot, and that chili has a lot of fat in it. And I used to be really healthy because I used to back in the day be a salsa dancer, right? And so we're really like healthy and lean. And we would go there, and our bodies aren't used to processing all that fat, so all that fatty acid that doesn't get broken down ends up in your stool, right? Imagine you're literally pooing out fatty acid and it burns your butthole, right? It burns your anus. And that doesn't feel good. Imagine that on the other end, right? On your urethral opening. No, thank you. I'm good. That would not feel good. So just keep that in mind. Buffers are amazing because they make it so that you can poo comfortably and you can pee comfortably. Okay, that's always a good thing. So keep that in mind when you think about H plus. Okay. All right. So now we know how to keep HCO3 minus just to keep homeostasis, right? But what if you just don't have enough to have a really good buffer system, right? What if you need more HCO3 minus? Your kidneys can help you with that. It's one of the very few places that you can generate, you can create new bicarbonate ion. So if you are too acidic, you can add more bicarbonate ion to help you buffer, okay? So that's really, really awesome. It's one of the few places that you can do that. All right, so when you look at this mechanism that we went over, right? This is in your PCT. This right here is you making more bicarbonate ion. This is you adding bicarbonate ion from your kidneys, okay? We've seen this mechanism before in the blood, right? So a lot of your HCO3 minus, the way you make it is by transporting CO2 in your blood. Your red blood cells help you make that buffer system. But if that is not enough, your kidneys can literally make new bicarbonate ion to help you regulate that pH, okay? So that's really, really important. That part is the part where you're making more HCO3 minus, okay? One of the few places. Okay. All right. That's not it. All right. The last thing you want to know here, right, is where this is coming from, right? So keep in mind that when you're making this new bicarbonate ion, it's happening in the PCT. Okay, so the proximal convoluted tubule. So that as soon as you get that filtrate into your nephron, you're starting to do that pH balance. You want to make sure that things are balanced so that the filtrate along the way is going to be balanced. Okay. The other things we want to look at in the next few slides are called intercalated cells. Okay. And we have two types. We have type A and we have type B. So type A will help you with acids and type B will help you with bases. Okay. So let's look at this first one. This is going to be type A. Intercalated cells. Okay. And what we're trying to do here is we're trying to get rid of acid. Okay. And we're trying to remove acid from our blood. Okay. So let's take a look at the step-by-step for that. Okay. The first part seems so familiar. We've seen it 1,000 times. We get water, CO2, and carbonic acid, and we end up making H2CO3. Remember, that just kind of happens everywhere, right? We end up having H plus and HCO3 minus. Okay. The goal here is to get rid of that H plus, right? So we're going to use a proton pump to remove that H plus into the filtrate. And in the filtrate, we're going to have phosphate buffer. So HPO42. We're going to combine that with our acid to help buffer it. Okay, so that when we pee, we're not burning everything, right? So it's important to buffer it. Here we're using the phosphate buffer in the filtrate to help us buffer that acid, okay? That's how we're able to remove it. The other thing that we can do is that we can take HCO3 minus, right? Our newly generated HCO3 minus, and we can add it into the blood using the chloride shift. Okay, so we're gonna move bicarbonate ion out, chloride in, and we can add bicarbonate ion into our blood. Okay, that's gonna help you remove acid from blood and add base to our blood. Okay, until you get to a nice even level. Okay, any questions on this mechanism? Key things to remember, right, is that you want to remove acid in intercalated type A cells. You're gonna buffer that acid using phosphate buffer systems in the filtrate. You're gonna add the bicarbonate ion back into the blood using chloride shift proteins, okay? So the other thing that we can do is we can make NH4, right? So when we make NH4, that's going to help us remove acid from our system, okay? So this is the most important mechanism for excreting acid. And this should be NH, oops, 4 plus. Okay, so let's take a look step by step on how this happens. One of the things you're going to notice that, like when you look at this mechanism, it might take you back to digestion because you've seen something similar in digestion. Okay, in the cell metabolism digestion chapters. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to take glutamine. Okay, so this is one of your amino acids. You're going to go ahead and undergo deamination, oxidation, or acidification, right? And you're going to end up with 2 NH4 plus and 2 HCO3, okay? So HCO3 minus. So you're going to have NH4 plus and HCO3 minus, okay? So the goal here, again, is to remove acid and keep base, okay? So that base is going to have to go back into your blood So we're gonna go ahead and use the sodium and bicarbonate ion symporter, right? Sodium's gonna power the movement of bicarbonate out of the cell, and you're gonna add bicarbonate ion back into the blood. Okay, so that helps you add base to your blood. We're trying to remove that acid, right? So we're gonna take that little bit of acid and we're gonna remove it out using an antiport. So sodium's gonna come in and the NH4 plus is gonna move out, okay? Sodium is powering the movement of that, okay? So sodium's the power and you're moving out that acid, okay? That NH4 plus can then be removed out in the urine, okay? So that ammonium smell that you have, it's due to this, okay? So that's why it smells like that kind of weird smell that you have in your urine, like that ammonia kind of smell, okay? It's coming from breaking down those amino acids to help you remove acid, okay? So some key things that you wanna remember here, right, is that you're using glutamine, an amino acid. You're undergoing deamination, oxidation, acidification, but the key here is that you're making NH4 plus. You want to remove NH4 plus by using an antiport with sodium. You want to keep bicarbonate ion by using a symport with sodium to move it back into blood, okay? So the key here is that you make NH4, remove that, and you want to keep bicarbonate ion. So with these two examples for type A intercalated cells, you're trying to remove acid and keep base, okay? Any questions on this NH4 excretion, or are you guys all good? It's big pictures. Okay. So both of those are type A. Now let's go ahead and look at type B. Type B helps you regulate the amount of base, okay? So type B intercalated cells are gonna be very special because this is the only place you get to secrete out HCO3 minus, okay? So make sure you know that. So you're removing out your base and you're gonna keep acid, okay? All right, I think we're good. Okay. The other thing I want to remind you of here, whoops, for bicarbonate ion secretion is that this is rare, right? So it's rare that we have to affect the amount of bicarbonate ion that we have in our system. Usually we're good. The thing that we have to change is acid. That's usually what we have to do. It's rare that we have to remove base, okay? And that's because it's rare that we're gonna make more HCO3 minus than normal. Usually the reasons why you would have too much base will be due to some sort of diet. So you're eating too many Tums, right? Think about the delicious Tums. That I was pregnant, I ate a bunch of those, right? They taste like candy. If you're a kid and you get access to those Tums, you're gonna eat a bunch of them, right? Some kids like it, like Alka-Seltzer because it tastes like 7-Up. And so if they drink too much, then that's not a good thing because it's a lot of bicarbonate ion. Sometimes parents will give too much sodium bicarbonate to their kids for whatever reason, because you can use it as a diuretic, you can use it for upset stomach, but giving too much can also change the pH of their blood. So it's important to kind of remember that bicarbonate ion, even though it's something that you can easily get through sodium bicarbonate, through baking soda, right? It's really easy to get. Too much is also not a good thing because then you're gonna have to kick in your type B cells and they have a capacity. They work really slow. And so if you have too much, you might have to go to the hospital, okay?
Professor, going back on what you said about the Sprite or 7-Up, like I don't know if this has anything to do with it, but sometimes when I'd be sick or something like that, my mom would give me like Sprite or 7-Up. She said it was like to make me feel better. I don't know if that has anything to do with what you said, but I don't know. I just thought it was funny.
No, I know. I mean, I grew up that way. So there's a few things that different parents will give you, right? One of the things that if you have an upset stomach, one of the things that they will give you is soda, right? And usually they're like clear soda, right? So like 7-Up. Sometimes they give you Mountain Dew. I don't know why that one's clear, but they think it's clear. Sprite, mineral water, right? All of those things are really normal, right? For people to give their kids if they have an upset stomach. Part of the reason they're doing that is because it has carbonation, right? This one has carbonation. So think about the bubbles. What they're trying to make you do is they're trying to make you burp and they're trying to make you fart. So those are the two things. So what they're trying to fix is gas, right? The other thing that they will give you to try to make you feel better is Alka-Seltzer, Picot. Picot is the Latino version of Alka-Seltzer, baking soda. Okay, Tums. All of these are buffers, right? All of these are buffers. So they're essentially giving you buffer for your stomach, right? And they're trying to, instead of add acid to your stomach, they're trying to make it more basic to neutralize the acid, right? Here, right, with the 7-Up, the Mountain Dew, the Sprite, the mineral water, this is gonna decrease your pH. It makes you more acidic. Okay, so sometimes if the 7-Up doesn't work, it might be because the pH of your stomach is too low, and what you really need is down here is Alka-Seltzer, Picot, baking soda, or Tums. Okay, so if the 7-Up doesn't work, move down to here, right? But these are all, pretty safe in general for people to take. The issue comes when you abuse how much of the dose that you're taking, right? Taking too much Alka-Seltzer is not good. Taking too much baking soda is not good. I'll tell you right now, if you take too much baking soda, you're gonna cause diarrhea. That's one of the things that you get, okay? So when they say half a teaspoon, half a teaspoon. Because if you take a full teaspoon, you're gonna be in the toilet in addition to having a tummy ache, right? So just keep that in mind. Tums is a very classic example, and we'll see this in a few slides, of having too much bicarbonate ion in your system because kids will take it. Kids will find the Tums, they will eat the whole bottle, and then you're gonna end up in the ER trying to have them regulate their pH, okay? But that's like, it's rare that you have to regulate the amount of bicarbonate ion that's in your blood, okay? But yeah, you guys can ask about anything that your parents do. I probably have been there, right? I'm right there with you. Let's see. Some of it makes sense, I'll tell you. Some of it, not so much. Let me see. Acid-base imbalances. All right. This, please no. Please no. Please no. Please no. Make sure that you know the difference between respiratory acidosis and metabolic acidosis. Respiratory alkalosis and metabolic alkalosis. Okay, make sure that you know the differences between the different types of acidosis and alkalosis. Okay, so when you have respiratory acidosis, alkalosis, this is due to you changing how you breathe. Okay, so you are not breathing in a normal pattern. You're either breathing too much, like breathing out too much. And when you breathe out too much, you remove a lot of CO2 from your blood. or you're holding your breath more than normal. So you're keeping more CO2 in your blood, okay? So the key here is your partial pressure of CO2 in the blood, okay? If you're holding your breath, it's gonna go up. If you're breathing a lot, it's gonna go down, okay? But that's the key value that you wanna look at. The other thing that we want to learn about is metabolic acidosis and alkalosis. So when we look at metabolic alkalosis and acidosis, it's not going to be due to your breathing. It's going to be due to addition of acids and bases into your blood from different avenues, right? So usually through different types of cellular metabolism, okay? So anything that's other than changing how you breathe. Okay. The key way that you know if it's metabolic is by looking at your bicarbonate ion levels. Okay. Cool. So if those are weird, then you're like, okay, something's wrong because they're breathing normal. So their PCO2 looks good, but something in their metabolism is off. Okay. So here, you know that your bicarbonate ion is normal, right? But their breathing, their PCO2 is off. Okay, here your HCO3 minus is abnormal, but your PCO2 should be normal. Okay, so your breathing is normal. Okay, so let's take a look at what can cause this, right? So let's look at respiratory acidosis alkalosis. This is changing how you breathe. Okay, so when you change how you breathe, you're going to notice changes in your PCO2. So you can have PCO2 above normal or PCO2 below normal. If you have too much CO2, so above normal, you have respiratory acidosis. Okay, remember more CO2 means more acid. If you have a lowered PCO2 in your blood, then you have respiratory alkalosis. Less CO2, less acid, more basic, okay? So when you look at respiratory acidosis, it means that you are usually somehow holding your breath, okay? For whatever reason, you're not able to breathe out normally, so more acid stays inside of your body, okay? So this is usually due to changes in ventilation. So one of the ways is emphysema, pneumonia, cystic fibrosis, okay? These are all different cases that we saw earlier with respiratory. People that cannot breathe out all of their air are gonna keep more CO2 in their alveoli. That means that it's gonna go back into your blood, okay? And that allows you to have increased acidity of your blood, okay? More CO2, more acid, lower pH, okay? When we look at respiratory alkalosis, you're changing how you breathe again, but this time you're breathing out more CO2 than normal. So because you're breathing out the CO2, you're losing acid. The most common reason is hyperventilation, and that's usually when you are like crying, right? Like, right? If you're really stressed, if you've ever had like an anxiety attack or panic attack, you know that you're breathing really shallow, really quick. And those things could cause it. And then pain is another one. Okay, so you can hyperventilate due to all of those different factors. Okay, the key here is that hyperventilation causes you to remove CO2. If you remove CO2, then you're going to lose acid. And if you lose acid, your pH goes down, goes up, sorry. Okay. Okay. All right. So this table has some other examples if you're interested. Okay. Metabolic acidosis and alkalosis, they're a little bit different, right? So this is due to some sort of cellular respiration or cellular metabolism that is either adding acid or removing acid, or if you're looking at diet, you're adding base. Okay, so let's look at metabolic acidosis first. Acidosis means that your blood is low on the pH. Okay, so you're gonna have less acid and more base. More acid, less base. Some of the reasons why you can get metabolic acidosis is if you drink too much, right? So alcohol, when you drink it, it goes in as ethanol, but it gets changed into acetic acid, okay? And that acetic acid can travel in your blood and cause it to become acidic, okay? Another reason is if you're removing too much bicarbonate ion, okay? And one of the ways that this can happen is if you have diarrhea, okay? So that HCO3 minus will get pushed out when you have diarrhea, and that means that you're losing it from your blood. So instead of having that base in your blood, you're losing it. That means you're off balance and you have more acid than normal, okay? You don't have something buffering that acid. So when you have diarrhea, you have to control it soon because you don't want that person to get metabolic acidosis, okay? The last one is lactic acid, and we've seen that before with things like exercise, right? We think about lactic acid with exercise, but you can also get it when you have shock. You can get it through ketoacidosis, right? Having too many ketones. You can get it when you have diabetic crisis where you're making those ketones, starvation, and kidney failure. Okay, so all of those things can contribute to an increased amount of acids that can't be regulated just through breathing, right? You have to regulate these by removing them in the filtrate. So this type of acidosis takes a while to help regulate it, okay? When you have metabolic alkalosis, now we're looking at pH going up, and you're looking at having more bicarbonate ion than normal, okay? So remember that this is usually really rare. We talked about Alka-Seltzer, we talked about Tums, we talked about Picot, right? All of those, if you take it in as a diet, right? If you're consuming it by eating it, that could cause metabolic alkalosis if you're taking too much, right? It's really rare because you have to like eat a lot of it. But one of the ways that you can have metabolic alkalosis naturally, right, through just your body working is by vomiting. So that's one of the things that can cause you to add base to your blood. So every time you vomit, what you're doing is you're emptying out your stomach acid, right? You're removing all that stomach acid. So as you remove it, your body wants to refill. So you're making more acid as you're removing acid. The key there is that every time you make an acid, you add bicarbonate ion to blood. So the more acid you make, the more bicarbonate ion you add to your body. So if you're vomiting and you can't control your vomiting, then you can't control how much base you're putting back into your blood. And that's one reason that if you're vomiting excessively, they're going to test the pH of your blood to see if you have metabolic alkalosis. Okay, so that's vomiting of acids. The intake of excess base, that's what we're talking about. Tums, Picot, Alka-Seltzer. Okay, so and acids. So you want to just make sure that you're taking it as required. Okay. Let's see. Hey, you guys' comments are funny today. Remove all the alcohol. Yes. All right. Let me see. So let's talk a little bit about what happens when you have respiratory and renal compensation. So So we've been talking about it, right? We know that if you have acidosis of any kind, you're going to change your breathing. If you have alkalosis of any kind, you're going to change your breathing, right? But the key here is that you're trying to quickly change the pH by changing your breathing, and you're trying to slowly regulate the pH using your renal system, right? The final best way to regulate it is through renal, right? Especially those metabolic acidosis and metabolic alkalosis situations. The only way to regulate it is really renal. Part of the reason you want to do that is because you want to maintain the pH within that narrow range, right? Normal is between 7.35 to 7.45. If you get out of that normal, proteins are going to stop working. Think about all of the places that you have protein. Think about all of the jobs that proteins do in your body. Think about all the enzymes, all the transporters, right? All the things that are in your body that are protein, they're going to start not working. One of the places that you are really going to have a consequence if you become too high or too low is your brain, right? Your central nervous system. If the pH is off, it's going to stop the proteins in your brain from working. That means that you're not going to function normally, right? That's everything. That's your heart, that's your lungs. That's a lot of reflexes that you have no control over. You won't be able to regulate your blood pressure, right? All of that is important to you. If you're not regulating that pH, it's going to be a really, really bad situation. Okay. All right. So if you want to learn more, you can look at all of the different ways that we regulate it. I'm not going to test you on these, but they're kind of nice to know. So you can see how extreme the symptoms can get if your blood pH gets too acidic or too basic. Okay. The key here, the key concepts that you want to get here is that you quickly try to resolve those problems using respiratory, and you slowly resolve the problems using renal. Okay. So imagine if you have renal failure, you need to have dialysis in order to help you regulate your pH. The foods that you eat, you're really going to have to think about, because the foods can really affect your buffer systems in your blood and your respiratory system, and in general, the pH of your blood. So you have to really be mindful of what you're eating when you have renal failure, because it's not just about the salt that you're getting, the water that you're getting, it's also the pH changes that happen in your blood, because you don't have that slow compensation of your kidneys to help you. So having your dialysis on time is going to be important. Okay. So let's look at respiratory compensation. Okay. When you have metabolic acidosis, your respiratory compensation is going to go ahead and ramp up. You're going to try to remove as much CO2 as possible to compensate while you can, okay? But I want you to think about what happens when you hyperventilate, right? If you're doing this, how long can you really sustain that, right? Imagine that you're doing that for hours, hyperventilating for hours. Right? Would you feel nice and relaxed, or would you feel tired if you're doing this? Nice and relaxed or tired, right? You're going to feel tired, right? Your muscles are going to start to fatigue. You're going to start to produce lactic acid. None of that is good, right? So when you start seeing somebody starting to hyperventilate, in your mind, you should start thinking, oh, maybe they have metabolic acidosis, especially if they have something like renal failure, because they can't regulate their pH normally. So if you see someone with renal failure that's starting to hyperventilate, you should probably take them to their doctor or urgent care just to double check the pH of their blood to see that they don't have acidosis. Okay. When you have metabolic alkalosis, then you're going to notice that they have slow, shallow breathing. Okay. Remember, again, this is rare. Okay. This is when you're vomiting excessively or you took way too much of antacid. Okay. So in this case, you're going to have slow, shallow breathing to keep the CO2 to help you raise the pH. Okay. And you're going to do that until you're able to get rid of as much HCO3 minus as needed. Okay. But remember, that is a slow process. So regulating this is slow. Okay. So let's take a look at how the kidneys help. Okay. The kidneys are awesome because they're slow, but they're going to really make an impact on bicarbonate ion concentration. Okay. So if you have acidosis, your kidneys are going to be able to reabsorb more HCO3 minus, and they're going to be able to make more and add more to your blood. So they're going to keep what they have, and they're going to make more and add it to your blood. The other thing that your kidneys can do is that they can remove acid, okay? Any form of organic acid that you've made, like lactic acid, you can remove it in the kidneys, okay? So you can't breathe out lactic acid, but you can remove it in the kidneys. It's slow, but it's there, okay? The other thing you're gonna do is you're gonna try to remove as much of that CO2, right, by removing that H+. So remember that we can spontaneously take that CO2 and water, put them together. When we break them back apart, you're going to have H+ and HCO3 minus. So that H+ gets secreted out, that HCO3 minus gets put back in blood. Okay. When we look at respiratory alkalosis, your kidneys are also going to be there to help you. If you have respiratory alkalosis, you're breathing out so much CO2 that you have way too much bicarbonate ion in your blood and we're out of balance. If you are having respiratory alkalosis, that means that you need to remove bicarbonate ion, okay? So your kidneys can excrete bicarbonate ion. Again, it's slow, but it'll do it, right? So it's gonna remove HCO3 minus, and it's gonna help you keep that acid that you need, okay? So you remove HCO3 minus, you keep acid, and that helps you get back to homeostasis. So any questions on the respiratory compensation or the renal compensation? Are you guys good? All of this is kind of, you notice it's a lot of repetition, right? It's big picture patterns. What are those patterns? Okay. Cool. Any questions on either one of them? You guys good? All righty. So I'm going to give you guys another 10-minute break. And then I'm going to give you 1 or 2 case studies to work together on. And then if you guys have any questions, you can ask. If not, then you guys are pretty good. Highly suggest to study your lab slides. Oops. So those lab slides and videos, you notice that I walked you through a little bit more, and that's because every single section, even the people that don't take me, they were all using it. So I go back to basics, right? What is chemistry? What are transporters? Stuff that you guys already know, I was trying to teach them just in case they didn't know. Okay, so that goes really step by step, really slow through all the pathways, okay? So I'm going to give you guys, let's do 15 minutes. So come back at 4:15. And we'll do some practice. Okay. We'll do 2 practice. Okay. So we'll break out into groups and then you guys can practice a little bit. And then if you have questions, cool. If not, then you guys are good. Okay. So I'll see you guys in 15 minutes.